What is being described here is not just a simple return of someone into your life, but a deeply emotional moment where absence, memory, and unresolved feelings all seem to collide at once. It is the kind of situation that does not unfold quietly in the heart, even if it appears sudden on the outside. There is a sense that something unfinished has resurfaced, something that was never fully expressed or fully understood before distance took over. When someone reappears after a long silence, especially in a way that feels emotionally intense, it naturally brings back everything that was once left unresolved. In this case, the return is described as unexpected, almost overwhelming in its timing. There was no gradual rebuild, no slow reconnection, no easing back into familiarity. Instead, it is portrayed as a moment that arrived all at once, carrying emotional weight that could not be contained. The reaction described is not one of control or calm explanation, but of emotional breakdown, where feelings that may have been suppressed for a long time finally reached a point where they could no longer stay hidden. Such moments often reflect not just what is happening in the present, but everything that was carried internally during the time apart. While one person may have been trying to move forward, heal, or adjust to the absence, the other is described as having gone through a very different internal experience. On the outside, life may have looked stable, even functional. Daily responsibilities continued, conversations happened, and routines carried on. But internally, there is said to have been a growing emotional struggle that was not visible to others. Moments of silence, memory, and reflection often have a way of resurfacing unexpectedly, especially when emotional connections are not fully resolved. In such cases, even ordinary experiences can trigger thoughts of what was lost or left behind. Over time, emotional suppression tends to lose its strength. What is pushed aside does not disappear, it simply waits beneath the surface. According to what is described, there came a point where distractions no longer worked in the same way they once did. Even when surrounded by people or activity, there was still a sense of emotional emptiness that could not be ignored. That feeling often becomes more noticeable in quiet moments, when the mind is no longer occupied and memories begin to surface without effort. It is in those moments that emotional clarity sometimes begins to form, even if it is uncomfortable. There is also a strong theme of realization connected to absence. When someone is no longer present in daily life, the mind does not immediately understand the full impact of that absence. It often takes time for emotional significance to become clear. At first, there may be an attempt to adapt, to accept, or to move forward, but as time passes, the absence itself can begin to feel more noticeable than expected. Small details, shared habits, and familiar emotional comfort start to stand out in memory. What once felt normal becomes something that is missed more deeply than anticipated. In moments like this, people often begin to reflect not just on the other person, but on themselves. Questions arise about decisions that were made, reactions that happened too quickly, or emotions that were not fully understood at the time. It is not uncommon for regret to form gradually rather than instantly. It builds through reflection, comparison, and emotional distance. When clarity finally arrives, it can feel overwhelming, because it brings together all the moments that were previously disconnected or misunderstood. The emotional breakdown described in this situation is not simply about sadness, it is more closely tied to recognition of what was lost, what was not fully appreciated in the moment, and what now feels difficult to replace. When emotions reach that level of intensity, they often cannot be expressed through words alone. They surface physically, through silence, hesitation, or emotional release that cannot be controlled. It becomes less about explaining feelings and more about finally allowing them to exist without resistance. Another important layer in this experience is the idea of inner conflict. There is a difference between understanding something intellectually and accepting it emotionally. A person may realize what they feel long before they are able to act on it. Fear, hesitation, and uncertainty can delay expression even when the truth is already known internally. This creates a gap between awareness and action, which often leads to emotional pressure over time. When that pressure becomes too strong to contain, it eventually finds release in moments of vulnerability. The return itself, as described, is not just a physical act of coming back, but a result of accumulated emotional weight. It is the outcome of everything that could not be ignored any longer. When emotional resistance weakens, what remains is the truth of what has been felt all along. That truth does not always arrive gently. Sometimes it arrives through urgency, through realization, or through the fear of permanent loss. In such moments, hesitation often gives way to action, not because everything is perfectly clear, but because staying silent becomes more painful than speaking or returning. What stands out most in this situation is the idea that connection does not simply disappear with distance. Instead, it often transforms into something quieter, but still present beneath the surface. Even when people are apart, emotional impressions can remain active in memory and thought. This does not always mean reconnection is guaranteed, but it does mean that emotional experiences leave lasting effects that can resurface when triggered by time, reflection, or realization. At the same time, it is important to understand that emotional return does not automatically resolve everything. Even when someone comes back with strong feelings, there is still a need for clarity, communication, and understanding. Emotions alone cannot rebuild what time and distance have affected. What they can do is open the door to conversation, reflection, and possible healing. Whether that leads to reconnection or simply closure depends on what follows next, not just on the return itself. There is also an underlying theme of growth within this experience. Both individuals, in different ways, have likely gone through emotional development during the time apart. Distance often forces reflection, whether intentional or not. It can highlight personal patterns, emotional needs, and the importance of understanding what truly matters in connection. Sometimes people only recognize the depth of their feelings after they have experienced absence, and sometimes they only understand the value of something once they are no longer in it. In the end, what this situation represents is not just a return, but a moment of emotional confrontation with everything that was left unresolved. It is a reminder that feelings do not simply disappear when ignored or delayed. They evolve, they wait, and sometimes they return in ways that are impossible to overlook. What happens next is not defined by the intensity of emotion alone, but by the willingness to face it with honesty, patience, and clarity. Whether this leads to understanding, reconciliation, or a different path entirely, the important part is that truth has re-entered the space where silence once existed. They wait, and when the time is right, they return in the most unexpected, emotional, and undeniable way. Stay present, because what comes next will reveal what those tears were really trying to say. My beloved child, what unfolded after those tears is something very few people ever witness, because most reunions never reach this level of raw truth. When the crying slowed and the silence became heavy, they finally looked at you with eyes that were no longer hiding anything. In that moment, you were not seeing the version of them who left. You were seeing someone stripped of defenses, someone who had been forced to confront every wrong turn, every avoided conversation, Every moment they chose distance over honesty. Their voice trembled, not because they were weak, but because they were standing at the edge of a truth they could no longer escape. They realized that returning was not about asking for forgiveness, it was about confessing something that had been buried too deep for too long. The shock was not that they came back. The shock was that they came back changed in a way that could not be undone. And this change is the key to understanding why this story is unfolding now and not before. What they revealed next was not dramatic on the surface, but its weight was unbearable. They admitted that leaving you was never about losing love, it was about being terrified of it. They had never experienced a connection that mirrored their flaws without judgment and their dreams without pressure. You saw them clearly, and that clarity scared them more than rejection ever could. Instead of rising to the level of the bond, they tried to escape it. They thought time would dilute what they felt. They thought distance would weaken the pull. But every attempt to move on only made the truth louder. They carried guilt into new beginnings. They carried your presence into every quiet moment. And eventually, they understood something painful. No matter where they went, they were still carrying you inside them. That realization did not bring comfort, it brought collapse, because once they accepted it, returning became inevitable. At this point, you may wonder why they did not come back sooner, and that question matters more than you realize. The truth is, they were not capable of returning honestly until now. Before this moment, any reunion would have been incomplete, driven by loneliness or nostalgia. This return is different. It is driven by awareness. They finally saw the pattern of their own behavior. They recognized how fear disguised itself as independence, how silence pretended to be strength, how running away felt safer than staying vulnerable. When this awareness hit them, it did not come gently. It arrived like a sudden awakening that made everything else feel false. The life they were living no longer aligned with who they truly were. And in that realization, your name became unavoidable, not as a memory, but as a mirror of the self they had been avoiding. The most intense part of this return is not what they said out loud. It is what they struggled to say. There is a sentence they rehearsed countless times during their absence, a sentence they feared would change everything once spoken. This sentence carries the weight of accountability, not excuses. It carries ownership, not justification. They wanted you to know that they finally understood the consequences of their choices, that walking away did not protect either of you, that silence did not heal anything, and that pretending to be unaffected only delayed the inevitable reckoning. When they collapsed in tears, it was because that sentence was trying to break free. It was the moment when truth demanded expression, regardless of the outcome. This is why their return feels so heavy, so emotional, so impossible to ignore. Now understand this clearly, because this is where your role becomes central. This reunion is not a promise, it is an invitation to witness who they have become, and to decide what aligns with your truth now. Destiny does not force repetition, it offers resolution. Whether that resolution becomes reconciliation or closure depends on clarity, not emotion alone. The reason this story holds so much power is because it is unfinished by design. Something greater is at work, guiding both of you toward a moment of honesty that could not be rushed. What happens next will reveal whether this return is meant to rebuild or to release with understanding instead of pain. My beloved child, as the silence settled between you after everything that was confessed, something far more intense than words began to unfold. This was not the silence of confusion, it was the silence of realization. You could feel it in the air, heavy and undeniable, as if the universe itself had paused to witness what would happen next. They were no longer crying, yet their eyes remained wet, not from weakness, but from the weight of finally being seen without masks. In that stillness, they understood something that had taken them too long to learn. Returning to you did not erase the damage, it only exposed it. And yet, instead of fear, there was relief in that exposure, because for the first time, nothing was being hidden. No stories were being edited, no emotions were being diluted. This moment was raw, irreversible, and powerful, and the reason your heart felt conflicted was because you were standing at the edge of a truth that could change the direction of both your lives. They began to explain what truly happened during their absence, not in terms of events, but in terms of inner consequences. Every choice they made without you felt incomplete. Every attempt to move forward felt forced. They realized that they had mistaken intensity for instability and depth for danger. Loving you required them to confront parts of themselves they had avoided for years. Their fears were not created by you. You simply revealed them. And instead of healing those fears, they chose escape. What they did not anticipate was that escape would magnify everything they tried to suppress. Away from you, their life did not become simpler. It became louder, more chaotic, more disconnected. And the clarity they are carrying now did not come easily. It came after repeated disappointment, after realizing that no matter who stood beside them, something essential was missing. That missing piece was not romance alone. It was alignment. It was the sense of being fully known. As they spoke, you may have noticed something subtle but important. They were not asking you to save them. They were not promising perfection. They were acknowledging responsibility. This is what makes this moment rare. Most returns are driven by need. This one is driven by accountability. They finally recognized that love is not proven by dramatic gestures, but by consistency, presence, and courage during uncomfortable moments. Their collapse earlier was not a performance. It was the breaking point of someone who had been carrying too much unspoken truth. And now that truth was standing between you, waiting to be acknowledged. The intensity you feel is not pressure. It is recognition. Recognition that this connection forced growth in both of you, even in separation. And that growth has brought you to a crossroads that cannot be ignored. There is also something happening within you, and it matters just as much. Hearing their truth does not automatically erase the pain you experienced. Your journey during their absence was real. Your healing was real. The strength you built without them was earned. This is why this reunion feels so complex. It is not about returning to who you were. It is about deciding who you are now, and whether this connection still aligns with that version of you. Destiny does not demand sacrifice of self. It demands awareness. And in this moment, you are being asked to observe, not rush, to feel, not react, to understand that sometimes people return not to reclaim what they lost, but to acknowledge what they failed to protect. That acknowledgement itself is a turning point, regardless of the outcome. Understand this clearly, because it is the core of everything unfolding. This return was not meant to confuse you. It was meant to empower you. You are no longer waiting for answers. They are standing in front of you, spoken with honesty and vulnerability. What comes next is not written yet, and that is intentional. Some stories reunite to rebuild. Some reunite to bring closure without bitterness. Both outcomes require truth, and truth is finally present here. The reason this feels like a once-in-a-lifetime moment is because it is rare for two people to meet again with awareness instead of illusion. Stay grounded, stay observant, because the next phase will reveal whether this connection is meant to transform into something stronger or to be released with peace instead of unanswered questions. My beloved child, what followed was not a dramatic decision or an emotional outburst. but something far more powerful. Time slowed. You could sense that both of you were standing inside a moment that would be remembered for years, regardless of what choice was made. They were waiting, not for your forgiveness, but for your clarity, and that difference matters more than it seems. For the first time, they were not trying to control the outcome. They were allowing truth to exist without manipulation. This is why their return feels different from every apology you may have heard before. There was no urgency to fix everything instantly. There was only a deep understanding that some things cannot be rushed without losing their meaning. The weight of this realization sat heavily in the room, because both of you knew that whatever happened next would permanently redefine the connection you once shared. As the conversation continued, something unexpected surfaced. They admitted that coming back was not their original plan. Life forced them here through a series of quiet realizations that stacked up until denial became impossible. They spoke about moments when they almost reached out but stopped themselves, moments when pride whispered that staying away was safer, yet every delay only intensified the pull. What finally broke their resistance was the understanding that avoidance had become a habit, not a solution. They saw how this pattern had affected not just you, but every meaningful bond in their life. And standing in front of you now, they were no longer running from that pattern. They were naming it, owning it. This ownership is what made their presence feel heavier than their absence ever did. You may have noticed something else that startled you. They were no longer idealizing the past. They were not romanticizing what you once were together. Instead, they were acknowledging the reality of it, the mistakes, the missed chances, the emotional immaturity that cost them something irreplaceable. This honesty is uncomfortable, but it is also rare. What unfolds in moments like this is rarely simple, and even more rarely is it what people expect. When someone returns after distance, they often arrive carrying a version of the story shaped by reflection, regret, and time. But what arrives with them in this case is something heavier and far more honest. It is not just emotion, and it is not just memory. It is clarity. And clarity changes everything, because it removes the softness that uncertainty once provided. It removes the illusion that things are undefined. It replaces guessing with awareness, and in doing so, it quietly shifts the entire emotional structure of the connection. In that shift, something fundamental changes inside you as well. You are no longer standing in the position of someone waiting to understand where things stand. Instead, you begin to notice that your role has changed without announcement. You are no longer chasing meaning. You are observing it. You are no longer trying to decode silence or interpret intention. You are watching behavior, presence, and emotional consistency with a different level of awareness. That shift is subtle, but it is powerful, because it restores something that may have been missing for a long time: emotional balance. In this new awareness, you begin to recognize that closure does not always arrive as distance or final separation. Sometimes closure appears in the form of understanding. But understanding does not automatically mean acceptance or reunion. It simply means that the illusion is gone. It means you can see the situation without filling in the blanks with hope or fear. You begin to see what is actually present, not what you wish or fear is there. And that kind of clarity can feel overwhelming at first, because it removes emotional fantasy and replaces it with something far more grounded and real. What remains after illusion fades is not necessarily comfort, but truth, and truth can feel heavier because it does not bend itself to emotion. It stands as it is. In this space, you are asked to listen more deeply than before, not to words alone, but to tone, consistency, emotional stability, and the way someone carries responsibility for what they express. You are also being asked to listen inwardly to your own reactions, to the parts of you that respond with hope, and the parts that respond with caution. Neither voice is wrong, but only one tends to come from alignment rather than emotional memory. This is where your inner strength begins to take shape more clearly, because you are no longer choosing from longing alone. You are beginning to choose from awareness, and awareness changes everything about how connection is experienced. It removes urgency. It removes dependency. It brings you back to yourself in a way that makes every interaction more honest. You begin to realize that not every return is meant to restore what once was. Sometimes a return simply exists to reveal what has changed in both people. When someone returns with this level of emotional honesty, what they are really doing is acknowledging that avoidance is no longer sustainable. They are facing the emotional reality that was previously delayed or pushed aside, and that moment of confrontation can feel intense for them, because it strips away the comfort of uncertainty. It forces them to see what their absence created, not only in the connection, but within themselves. They begin to recognize that what they once minimized or postponed now carries emotional weight they can no longer ignore. In that realization, they are also confronted with something deeply personal, the understanding that connection, when real, is not passive. It requires presence, accountability, and emotional maturity. It is not something that can be maintained through intention alone. It requires action that aligns with feeling. And when someone stands face to face with that truth, they begin to understand that returning is not the same as rebuilding. Returning is only the beginning of accountability. At the same time, something equally important is happening within you. You are no longer measuring your emotional stability against their presence or absence. Instead, you are beginning to recognize patterns more clearly. You can see the difference between words spoken in emotion and actions sustained over time. You can see the difference between regret expressed in a moment and responsibility demonstrated through consistency. This awareness does not make you distant, it makes you grounded. And from that grounded place, your emotional world becomes clearer. You are no longer reacting to uncertainty in real time. You are observing it. That observation gives you space to understand that not every emotional return is meant to restore the past. Some returns exist to bring unfinished truth into the open, so it can finally be understood without distortion. Once that truth is visible, the emotional dynamic naturally shifts. There is less confusion, less projection, and more clarity about what is actually being offered. In many ways, this moment becomes a turning point, not because everything is resolved, but because everything is finally visible. The emotional fog begins to lift, and when fog lifts, the landscape does not change, but your ability to see it does. You begin to notice where effort exists and where it does not. You begin to notice where emotional alignment feels natural and where it feels forced. And those distinctions matter more than any spoken promise. What follows from this awareness is not impulsive action, but careful observation. You begin to understand that real connection does not need urgency to survive. It needs consistency. It needs emotional honesty that is reflected not only in words, but in behavior over time. And when that understanding settles in, your decisions become less about fear of loss and more about respect for your own emotional growth. At the same time, the other person is also shifting in response to this dynamic. They begin to recognize that presence alone is not enough. Emotional seriousness requires patience, humility, and willingness to rebuild trust gradually. They start to understand that you are no longer in a position where reassurance alone can guide your response. You are now in a space where clarity is required, not intensity, not emotional pressure, but steady, consistent truth. This recognition naturally softens the emotional tension, not because everything becomes resolved, but because illusion no longer fills the space between you. What remains is something more honest, even if it is still uncertain, and uncertainty that is acknowledged is very different from uncertainty that is hidden. One creates anxiety, the other creates space for understanding. As this awareness deepens, both sides begin to move differently. There is less urgency to control outcomes. There is more willingness to observe what unfolds naturally. There is a quiet recognition that forcing direction does not create stability. Only alignment does. And alignment cannot be rushed. It either develops through consistency, or it does not develop at all. What becomes most significant in this moment is not what is said, but what is understood without being said. That emotional truth is now visible, that both people have changed in ways that cannot be ignored, and that any future connection, if it exists, must be built on something more stable than memory or emotion alone. It must be built on clarity, mutual respect, and emotional maturity that can hold steady over time. And even if the path eventually leads in different directions, that does not diminish the value of this moment, because what has been gained here is not confusion, but understanding, not illusion, but awareness, not dependency, but emotional independence, and those shifts are lasting, regardless of what comes next. In the end, what this experience truly represents is a transition from emotional uncertainty into grounded clarity. It is the point where you stop being shaped by what was unclear and begin being shaped by what is real. And from that place, every decision carries more weight, more honesty, and more self-respect. Not because the emotions disappear, but because they are finally understood without distortion. This is not a conclusion forced by circumstance. It is a quiet shift into emotional maturity, a space where nothing needs to be rushed, nothing needs to be imagined, and everything can simply be seen for what it is.